Most coaches find themselves in a situation where they consider making changes to an athlete's technique. There might be a variety of reasons why making those changes is important, but coaches need to understand that making changes isn't as easy as dealing with what they see as a physical issue. I'm not going to get into the fact that what we see as the issue isn't always the problem. As a coach, I'd always go backwards in the pattern of movement to see if the genesis of the problem is back upstream. Until you address the real cause of the problem, you won't solve it at all. In this podcast, I'm going to focus on the main issues surrounding changing any athlete's technique. Even though we think we're attending to the physical action as we see it, we're attempting to change or adjust the wiring in the brain. Think of the body as sort of a marionette or puppet that dangles under the brain and is managed by the neurons in the brain. In this case, we're asking neurons that are tasked with operating a working muscle a certain way to change how those neurons operate a muscle. It might seem as simple as reprogramming a few neurons to raise a little finger instead of lower it, but it's really more complex than that. It all comes down to the fact that the human brain prefers to stay vigilant as far as the environment around us is concerned. And even though we live in modern times and AI is on the horizon, that lizard brain back there is still in charge, and it thinks there are threats lurking around every corner. Close one. Gotta stay vigilant. To maintain that vigilance, the brain automates everything we do. It does a lot of stuff in the background that we don't even notice, but anything to do with sport has to be learned and then automated. When we learn how to swim a specific freestyle or a technique or whatever it is we're working on, it begins by exploring the concept in the right hemisphere. Think of this as sort of the discovery phase as it explores what it's trying to master. Once it feels like it understands the pattern, it then shifts the operation to the left hemisphere. This is where it becomes automated and becomes something we can do without having to think about it. Over time, it enhances the strength of the electrical signal to the working muscle by myelinating the neural pathway or map. A simple way of explaining automation is a swimmer swimming laps and realizing after doing a tumble turn that you have no recollection of ever thinking about doing a tumble turn. It just sort of happened for you. Since the brain is more concerned with threats, there's no way it wanted to crash into the wall, so it just executes what it knows. In this case, it hit the tumble turn switch for you, which thankfully we've all been there. So the reason changing technique and rewiring the brain is hard to do is because the human brain is resistant to change. Much of our personal stubbornness is born out of the brain's innate stubbornness. It doesn't like to change what it already knows, and it's opposed to doing something that is likely to distract it from its preferred vigilance. It's much better if we still correct programming or software for, say, freestyle at a very young age, and we teach young athletes exactly what the foundations of freestyle are, so they can develop their technique as they evolve and grow. However, the older the athlete gets, the harder it is to effect change. If you look at the chart on the right, you can see that younger athletes adapt much faster than older athletes. The problems really start when they're older and they have been using the same pattern for many years. When you're dealing with physically mature athletes, it can get into taking years or never at all, depending on the genetics of the athlete in question. I've had an athlete who arrived in college as a multi-sport athlete. She wasn't a full-time swimmer because she played basketball and soccer at the same time. It took her 3 to 4 weeks to develop a new technique. On the other hand, an athlete who had been a swimmer all her life took almost 18 months to get to a point where she was able to achieve her best time. When I deal with athletes at that age, I always start by asking them if they want to make the change. In some cases, it can resemble opening a Pandora's box if you don't know what you're doing. So I think it's very important that the athlete's on board with the process. Complicating all of this is the fact that some kids are born with a high level of physical intelligence. Their gift has been born with the innate ability of knowing where their body parts or appendages are in space and time. Making changes seems easy and effortless for them, while the majority of athletes find change a serious challenge and involves a long, drawn-out trial and error process. To get the brain to learn a new pattern that is inside or close to the original pattern, I would recommend these methods. Start by creating an environment where they can rehearse the new pattern or skill on land. If possible, add weight or some kind of resistance to the pattern of movement that they're working on. It would be even better if they can be put into an unstable environment like standing on a Bosa ball, so they could connect this new pattern to the core stability of the body or the structural integrity of the body. I'd also suggest that in a safe environment that they close their eyes, and what that does is it helps the motor cortex and the centric cortex get in harmony. By doing that, you help the athletes gain a much stronger understanding of what the movement pattern really feels like. Once they've gained a proprioceptive understanding of what they're doing on land, move the process into the water, but understand this. The brain is going to be more inclined to do or reproduce what it knows, so you must trick the brain into thinking it's doing something new. The way to do that is to add resistance or weight to the process. If, for instance, you're dealing with a right arm in freestyle, you can put a weight on the right wrist, and the brain will be like, that's different. What's going on here? That's sort of new. Or you could add some resistance to the whole process, and will help the brain get into that sort of discovery, exploratory mode and start to figure out what exactly it's trying to do relative to the encumbrances it's dealing with. By taking that approach, the brain will be able to explore this new pattern without the hindrance of being confused by the old pattern. Follow that up by alternating patterns of resistance-based mindful technique pattern swimming and mindful technique-based swimming with no resistance, and as it evolves, add a short speed-based component to the equation. The example provided shows you the process and the best way to help the brain fully understand how that new movement pattern integrates what you want the athlete to do. The big question is, how long does this take? Well, it varies based on the age and the athlete's duration in the sport, but if we're dealing with a fully mature athlete, this would be your best guideline. If you were able to track the electrical activity in the brain relative to the new pattern of movement, you would notice that it takes about a week for neurons to drop what they were doing with the old pattern and begin to connect to this new pattern. After about 3 to 4 weeks, the large majority of neurons have now connected to the new pattern. Think of it as taking up to a week to gain a sense of that new pattern and approximately a month before they can execute that new pattern without having to think about it. However, any loss of concentration or focus of what they're doing during this development period will cause the brain to simply go back to doing what it knows. Allowing the brain to wander off during the process will just simply derail the entire process. Just a reminder that to enhance learning, the athletes need to attach emotion to the process. It's why finding wins is so important in training or technique development. The feeling of a win allows an athlete to say, "Well done to me." When strong positive emotions are connected to learning, the brain takes notice and saves everything connected to that event. If the athlete ignores or misses the milestones, or the event will be discounted by the brain when it goes through the day's events during the athlete's sleep cycle. The key is wins and emotions should be part of the learning process, so make sure you're observant and help them celebrate every win along the way. In closing, I'd like to reinforce the concept of athlete ownership. When you give athletes exposure to the underpinnings of everything you know and allow them to take ownership over their growth as athletes, they increase their ability to achieve their organic potential. More importantly, by making them thinkers, explorers, and evolvers prior to their teenage years, you will give them all the tools they will need to help facilitate change at the later stages in their career.